presenters are Bruno Xavier and Shannon Prezzello. So let me introduce Bruno Xavier. He is the food engineer with a PhD in microbiology. He has worked as a processing authority at the Cornell Food Venture Center since 2016, where he provides comprehensive assistance to beginning and established food entrepreneurs. Bruno also provides technical assistance to the Cornell Center of Excellence for Food and Agriculture, which assists entrepreneurs and startups in business mentoring, research, partnerships, supply chains, and a myriad of research designed to position New York State as a global leader in food and agriculture. And he works with Shannon Prezzello, who has a Bachelor's of Science in Community Health from State University of Brockport. Her experience is focused in working with farmers, producers, aggregators, and distributors to create a viable regional food system for Rochester and the Finger Lakes. Since 2015, Shannon has been working with food entrepreneurs at Cornell University's Food Venture Center in Geneva, New York, providing product analysis, review, consultation, and safety validation to successfully bring new food products to market. Shannon is a Produce Safety Alliance trainer in the FMSA Produce Safety Rule and a Preventive Controls Qualified Individual for Human Foods. So with that, I think Bruno is going to start the presentation, and then Shannon will follow up. Okay, welcome, Bruno.
Thank you, Diane. It's a pleasure to be here, as always. It's a great pleasure to be involved with the CCE, and you have done so much to help the food industry in these different counties that end up converging to the excellent work that you do in the Saratoga region. It is a pleasure to speak about reduced oxygen packaging today to you all. I think we had previous meetings that led to this conversation, and it's a project that we are very excited about. It's I think there is an important social economical impact that we can contribute by starting with this initial discussion here, in which we hope to I don't know, from what Diane said, is avoid the concerns that might have been there because of lack of knowledge about the not only the regulation, but most importantly, the science behind reduced oxygen packaging. And I hope we will do some of that today. And of course, we will continue to be available and hoping to be able to contribute more to this endeavor, which I will say again, I think is a very important project. I really hope that we can succeed and that this success can be replicated in other regions and other states as well. Hoping that being the farm to fork way of doing business throughout our country. So this presentation is part of a series of trainings, lectures that we created as part of a grant, and we made it more adequate for the goal. The goal here, my part is very general about the science behind reduced oxygen packaging. But this is just one example of the kind of trainings that the Food Venture Center provides throughout the year. We're going to go through that science here. We will examine the different methods of reduced oxygen packaging. I encourage you to ask questions in the middle of the presentation here. Of course, we have a limited amount of time, but you might have questions that will help your colleagues here, because it seems that everybody is in a similar boat when it comes to the goals of this project here. So please feel free, if you want to talk about technologies that you have available that you don't understand. Let's try to answer as many questions as we can. We will also identify the food safety hazards. So where are those fears coming from? From those inspectors, from the people that did not like Margaret's idea, right? And so we will identify the food safety hazards and controls for food safety hazards related to reduced oxygen packaging. Okay, we will say there are reasons to be concerned. There are also tools to control those safety hazards. And then Shannon comes later detailing the regulatory requirements that will need to be, that apply to these processes. So let's start with the basics. What is reduced oxygen packaging? It's not only vacuum packing. To begin with, when we talk about reduced oxygen packaging, you might think of something like we see in the picture here, is steaks in vacuum packed plastic bags, but it's not the only situation. You might have seen, of course, Doritos, right? My favorite snack that I cannot buy because it's too addictive. But that is also reduced oxygen packaging, and it's certainly not vacuum. So what we have there is a modified atmosphere in which you have gases that are inert. So reduced oxygen packaging is a term that was carefully chosen because oxygen is the reason why we choose these packages, and also oxygen is the lack of oxygen is what leads to the hazards that we will discuss later. So you can remove the air altogether, leading to vacuum, or you can replace the air with a mixture of gases that do not contain oxygen. In most cases, you have a mixture of nitrogen and carbon dioxide. And the more pure the mixture is, the more expensive it is as well. And the changes are phenomenal. We used to, for a project that I ran, we used to purchase a gas mixture that was 99.999, so 1 per 10,000 parts of oxygen or less, and that cost more than $500. If we could go with 99.9% free of oxygen, it would cost less than 50. So there is a huge variation in prices of gas mixtures because the cost of purification is so high. So usually for food grade gases, they still have some level of oxygen left, but you don't want in any oxygen in the packaging if you can avoid it. There are many techniques to lower that oxygen content, but all that I'm trying to say here is that it varies. But why do we do it? First of all, well, it's not moving. Okay, why we do it? Well, first of all, we vacuum pack to extend the shelf life for certain products, and there are two things here that are important to emphasize. It extends the shelf life of products in general, but not all. So why is the shelf life usually extended? Oxygen is a catalyst for many chemical reactions. Okay, these reactions are in general referred to as oxidation. So fats, vitamins, and proteins are very susceptible to oxidation. That may lead certainly to the degradation of color, even texture, smell, but most importantly, in most cases, nutritional factors. So a lot of the enzymes, a lot of the vitamins can lose their nutritional role once they are oxidized. In oxygen, presence of oxygen is one way that those reactions will be happening faster. Light also catalyzes this reaction. So it's not only oxygen, but once you remove the oxygen, you are looking at oxidation happening a lot slower, okay? So that's one side, chemical oxidation. The other major factor, which is usually one that we care most about, is microbial degradation. A lot of microorganisms will not grow in the absence of oxygen. They require oxygen to grow. And those are many yeasts and molds. Molds are very important in this case. So when you remove the oxygen, all these organisms will be either not growing at all or growing a lot faster, okay? A lot slower, I'm sorry. So vacuum packing has a very specific effect. It does increase the quality of the final products and make them last longer, okay? So I think we covered everything here: oxidation of fats and vitamins, loss of color, and also reduces internal container corrosion is another possibility here. Is not very important for most of the uses that we're discussing for vacuum packing. We will be using plastic, and most of them will not be corroded. But if you have a can, a metal can, lack of oxygen inside the can for, imagine, hot-filled, acidic, preserves or conserves, they will last longer because there is no oxygen inside that can. There are many types of reduced oxygen packaging techniques, as we discussed. The most common is vacuum packaging. In this case, you apply a low pressure in the environment where the bag is going to be sealed. And vacuum is not a very accurate term. Better would be to say low pressure packaging, but because vacuum is complete absence of anything in that space, and that's not where we're getting. You can see that there is still air packets inside the pockets inside the bag, indicating that you do not have complete vacuum, and that's also the reason why you will have some oxygen left when you're using vacuum packaging. Equipment may give you more or less vacuum depending on the quality of the equipment. That will also vary depending on the process used. We also have controlled atmosphere packaging, in which you will change in real time the atmosphere in an environment. For example, greenhouses or similar environments where you are ripening fruits, you may have a controlled atmosphere packaging, which will be actively changing the atmosphere surrounding a fruit or vegetable. Usually that's where they're applied for. You also have modified atmosphere packaging. The snack bag that I mentioned is one example. You will remove the air and introduce something else. You have also cook chill processing and sous vide, which are processes that lead to reduced oxygen packaging, and the same regulations apply because the final product has a lower oxygen concentration inside the bag. We'll be discussing those briefly. So vacuum packaging, you reduce the air from the package, and the bag is always hermetically sealed. So the type of plastic used for these bags is specific for that purpose. The great thing also is that when you remove the oxygen or the air from inside the bag, you freeze the product, a process that leads to changes in the water content of the product. So if you freeze the product and it's not vacuum packed, think of meat, the water of the meat goes into the free atmosphere and forms crystals. So the meat becomes dry, and you have those annoying crystals inside those bags, and we call it freezer burn, right? So vacuum packing also prevents that process, and the frozen meat lasts a lot longer. Includes vacuum skin packaging, which is another technique, and can be achieved by physical application of vacuum, as we see in the vacuum sealers. But you can also achieve vacuum by applying a high fill temperature. So if you fill hot sauce or tomato paste in a can, and while it's still hot, you close that hermetically, the steam in the head space will condense and pull a vacuum. The other advantage of using a high fill temperature is that when you heat a water-based medium, you expel the oxygen. Oxygen is more soluble in water at lower temperatures. It's the opposite of solids, okay? If you have salt in water, the higher the temperature, more soluble salt will be. For oxygen, is the opposite. The higher the temperature, the less soluble oxygen will be in water. And that's extremely important because when you vacuum pack a vegetable, for example, that vegetable, if depending on the exposure to light, if it was exposure to light, you had photosynthesis still going on, so it will have oxygen in the exposed structure. If you think of a cucumber, it's green in the surface, you still have photosynthesis happening, you have gases of the respiration or photosynthesis dissolved in the product. So those gases will be still, of course, confined inside the vacuum packed bag after the process is done. And that has important implications for safety of the product and also shelf life of the product. It's good for safety. It's not very good for shelf life. So it's common in the industry that will, for example, we saw a picture of sliced cucumbers in a vacuum packed bag. Those will have to be frozen to be commercialized, but in any case, it is very important to blanch those slices before they're vacuum packed, exactly to eliminate the respiratory gases and provide a longer shelf life to that product. It's a technique that you would probably be using if you vacuum pack a similar product. Here we're talking about the cucumbers, right? But anything that has a green surface, any vegetable, any fresh vegetable, you will probably be doing a short blanching step in hot water. Can be achieved also by steam flushing closures. So if you think about that product, the tomato sauce inside the can, you can apply steam on the head space. You replace the air with steam. That steam, the same thing, will condense and then give you extra vacuum. And the type of vacuum packing technology that we hadn't talked about in the beginning, mechanical air evacuation. And we have two means of doing this. You can reduce the vacuum inside the package and then apply an external seal. But you can also have the bag put in an environment, imagine a vessel. That vessel will have a sealer inside. So you apply the vacuum to the entire vessel, and then the seal will be applied and everything will be under vacuum after you release the vacuum in the vessel. And these are the two types we're discussing. So in this example here on the left is a smaller, if you have these machines that you can purchase for around $100 nowadays, and you have a preformed bag, the machine will create a vacuum just inside the bag and will seal. So that's what this does. Okay, outside the bag during the vacuum packing process, you have atmospheric pressure. So the important thing is that because you have vacuum inside the bag and atmosphere pressure on the outside, during the process of vacuuming, the bag looks tight already. The bag looks empty, just attached to the product, right? So you can tell the product is working when that happens. Now, on the right here, we have a vacuum sealer, usually a bit of a bigger scale. In this case, you put the bag inside this area here, and you close the lid. So the internal environment will be totally evacuated, and you apply negative pressure. And the seal will be performed in one of the sides here. I'm not sure where this, oops, sorry, where it's gonna be, but probably in the front here, you're gonna have the seal. The bag during this process will not look empty, evacuated, right? It's low pressure. The entire environment inside that machine is at low pressure. So the bag may actually puff up, okay? Just because the air or dissolved gases is being evacuated from the wet surface of the wet matrix of the food. So it may puff up during that process, and only when the vessel is allowed to reach atmospheric pressure, at the end you hear that loud noise of the air entering the machine, then the bag will look empty, it will look evacuated, and the product will be under vacuum. So they're similar processes, but during the process it looks completely different. I wish we had a video to show this, but main message here, depending on the process, the bag may look evacuated on the left type, or may look full of something, air or whatever, on the right, on the type of machine on the right. That doesn't mean that it's not working, okay? We get that question quite a bit. So this is an example of controlled atmosphere packaging. in which you have not simply removed the air, or you may not even remove the air. You may just introduce a control to actively remove oxygen from inside the bag. You can see here, in this case here, you have an oxygen scavenger. You can see here O2 something, okay? But that's basically a metal or a metal compound that will oxidize so fast that it will not give the oxygen a chance to oxidize, in this case, the jerky meat inside the bag. So it keeps the oxygen content low, and that's extremely effective because plastic is never 100% impermeable to oxygen. Some oxygen will always go through the plastic. So those little packets can extend the time in which the product will be protected. I will also want you to notice that this is, of course, is a pouch, and you can see that most of the pouch is not, it doesn't let light through, right? You have just a window here where you can see some of the product, and that helps with the shelf life. As I said, not only oxygen catalyzes the oxidation, light will do that too. So if you can have a package that is completely opaque, or just have a window so that, because we love to see what we are buying, right? When we are at the grocery stores, it make a huge difference in our purchasing decision to be able to see the actual product inside the bag. But if you can reduce the size of these windows, is very effective at increasing the shelf life and improving the taste of the final product. Of course, it adds to cost of the bags, but it may be worth it. Okay, so oxygen scavengers, the sachets incorporated into the package. Usually in these products, we have a second control to microbial growth, which is water activity. So you remove water, and that will control the microbial, the growth of pathogens. Okay, and this is why these products can be sold without being frozen, right? They don't have to be frozen. They don't have to be refrigerated because they're dry. And this also helps prevention of discoloration in meats. You can even have a high concentration of CO2. And I'm not sure if in the US it is allowed, but you can use carbon monoxide to preserve the color of meats as well, in tandem with nitrates, so that it looks very red, even after drying. And those packets can help with that. Here are some other examples of modified atmosphere packaging that is not active, so you don't have an oxygen scavenger inside the bag. Usually that's the solution for fresh vegetables, okay? So you simply remove the gas with a mixture of nitrogen and carbon dioxide and some oxygen. In some of these bags, and this requires very advanced equipment and testing, routine testing, but you leave just the amount of oxygen that is necessary to make the product safe. So for the microbes that we were talking about in a few minutes, there is a minimum limit of oxygen that is sufficient to prevent their growth. So if you can show that your oxygen package is at that level, you would be able to get a longer shelf life, and you can balance that with the type of product and the type of distribution that your company has. But those are, usually just for large companies with machines that can control that type of, the concentration of oxygen inside the bag at that level of confidence. Just quickly, cook, chill, and sous vide. These are processes in which basically you have the hot product in the final package, and for that reason, you will have reduced oxygen in the final container. And the difference between cook, chill is that in cook, chill, you will cook the product and then add it, put it back into a plastic bag and vacuum seal. So you have a product that was hot, so it doesn't have any oxygen dissolved. Now is under vacuum, so is a reduced oxygen packaging. And that product will last a long time. However, the safety hazards apply to those products, and I will tell you the basics of how we control it, and Shannon will tell you the details on that. And sous vide is a technique in which you can vacuum pack a product that is fresh, and that's how I make steak these days. I really think it's amazing. You can cook the steak at a low temperature in order to get the steak that is just, going from red to pink, which is where I like it to be. You cook it at 132 Fahrenheit. So you can cook it for 4 hours. So it is thoroughly cooked. And then, you just put it in a frying pan for 3 minutes on each side. So you have a perfectly seared steak, but that is extremely tender. And even the fat becomes tenderized because of that process, but it is still, it has a taste of steak that was not overly cooked. But anyways, so that's the process. You vacuum pack, put that to cook, and you never take it out of the vacuum packing bag until you are ready to serve. So restaurants use that a lot. They pre-cook the meals, and when they have an order, they either put that in a microwave or in a pan, depending on the type of product, and they cook it to order. It's extremely important to follow the storage instructions to make sure that those products are safe. Let's quickly talk about biological hazards in reduced oxygen packaging, and they're basically two. One is Listeria monocytogenes, and the other is Clostridium botulinum. Okay, Listeria monocytogenes is a microorganism that is very common in refrigerated areas of the food manufacturing world. Anywhere where you have cold storage conditions, you will be concerned about the potential for contamination with Listeria. And because Listeria likes those conditions, where it's wet and cold, Listeria will have an advantage because they survive and even grow in those conditions. Listeria can cause foodborne infection, and the highest risk that Listeria imposes is on inducing abortion. Okay, it's extremely dangerous for pregnant women for that reason, and even at very low doses, like 20 cells, can lead to that. So we are extremely concerned about Listeria. It can also cause a foodborne infection at higher doses to anyone, even healthy individuals, but most susceptible are immunocompromised and the elderly. As I said, they can grow at refrigeration temperatures, and it can grow in low oxygen conditions as well. Luckily for us, Listeria is relatively easy to destroy with heat. So you're only concerned about Listeria contamination from the environment or from handling the product. Clostridium botulinum is a completely different situation. It creates, it produces a spore that is extremely hard to kill. If you boil a food product for 16 hours, you will still have not achieved destruction of these spores, so they're extremely resistant, and they cause a foodborne intoxication. If those spores can germinate, become a vegetative cell in the food and produce the toxin, you eat the toxin, is very unlikely that you will see the light of day again. 20 nanograms of the toxin is sufficient to kill an adult human person. It's an extremely deadly toxin. It's one of the most deadly things that we know of. Okay, luckily Clostridium is relatively rare. Listeria is pretty much everywhere. Clostridium botulinum is not, and the reason they're not is because they are extremely sensitive to oxygen. So now you're getting why we're so concerned about reduced oxygen packaging. We remove that barrier against Clostridium botulinum, which is everywhere around us, right? So the other thing that Clostridium botulinum likes is low acid foods, those foods that have a pH above 4.6. Basically, all the pictures that we saw before now are of low acid foods. So fresh meats, fresh vegetables, except tomatoes, and many fruits such as mango, avocados, will have low acid, will have low pH as well. So when you vacuum pack these low acid foods, you're creating an ideal environment for the growth of Clostridium botulinum. That is the main reason why all the regulations on reduced oxygen packaging exist. They grow in low oxygen conditions, and they are sporiforms. We already mentioned about that. Is it possible to control Clostridium botulinum with refrigeration? Yes, it is. But there are some strains of Clostridium botulinum that will grow even at relatively low temperature. Not 41, but when you reach 45 Fahrenheit, some strains of Clostridium botulinum can grow. And Shannon will be talking about the controls, so how important it is to control temperature, and that's the level of control that you have to have. You cannot reach a temperature above 45, or Clostridium botulinum would have been able to grow because of temperature. When you freeze the product, you are doing two things. You are lowering the temperature tremendously, but you're also freezing the water. And when the water is no longer liquid, bacteria cannot grow. Okay, so freezing is a very effective way of preventing growth of Clostridium botulinum. Okay, so there are ways to make reduced oxygen packaged foods and still be able to sell them without being frozen, which is, we mentioned this situation, foods with water activity below 0.91, so they are dried, and foods with a pH of 4.6 or less, they are acidified. In both cases, you can vacuum pack the food and sell under refrigeration, not freezing, right? It's also a lot safer to store them if you don't have very good controls of your freezer, for example. You can use chemicals to inhibit growth. For example, salt concentration, but also using nitrites. Okay, so there are specific concentrations of nitrites that should be used for different kinds of meat products in which they are allowed, and 120 ppm of sodium nitrite is sufficient. And that's the dose that we usually recommend here in the Food Venture Center. You will need a scheduled process for such products. I don't envision any school program making a turkey anytime soon. It is quite complicated, but it's important to know that those you would need a scheduled process. You can also use niacin, which is a bacteriocin. It's a protein produced by lactic acid bacteria, which would be effective, and also celery extract. Celery extract has a lot of nitrites, so it's a natural source of nitrites that can be used. When you see uncured products in the shelf in vacuum packed, you can usually see that they use celery extract or similar for to reach that inhibitory level for Clostridium botulinum. So depending on the product, you can rely on proper cooking and refrigeration. So you cook the product to a level that will eliminate those spores of Clostridium botulinum that could grow under refrigeration. Like it's great that these spores that grow at low temperature are also easier to kill. So the magic number there is 194 Fahrenheit for 10 minutes. That's usually called a cook, a CBOT cook in the industry. So that's the minimal process required to destroy the spores of psychotrophic, meaning Clostridium botulinum strains that grow at low temperature. And is used for many industries. And proper sanitation, that's the key for Listeria monocytogenes control in environmental monitoring as well. Okay, so this is my, I think, okay. So hazard control in reduced oxygen packaging, constant refrigeration, you will have that use of oxygen, permeable film. It kind of defeats the purpose of extending the shelf life because oxygen will be present and oxidation can still occur. Make sure that you have a high level of non-pathogenic bacteria, okay? Luckily for us, Clostridium botulinum is a WIMP, and they are usually in very low levels of contamination. So if you have a high level of good bacteria in the product, they will eat the food before Clostridium has a chance to wake up from their sleep. So you can have a bioprotective culture protecting the food. You can certainly use freezing, as we discussed. You may have a product that is refrigerated for safety, so it will have a use by date after which it's no longer safe to eat. Avoid cross-contamination after cooking or during retail packaging to make sure that you don't have those problems increasing the risk level of your product. Go. The safe use of these reduced oxygen packaging technology mandates that your product must be refrigerated during the entire shelf life, unless it is receiving a process that will lead to commercial sterility, which is not what we are considering here. A process that will lead to commercial sterility will be retorting, right, or aseptic filling. Those are expensive equipment that we are not considering at this point. Pathogens may survive the final product if the pasteurization is inadequate. So if you have a product that is being manufactured on the scheduled process, you will need records of the pasteurization temperature and time. Raw materials may be of poor quality, and you might have a higher count of pathogens than the process considered. Products handled poorly, if you do not maintain the quality of the operation procedures, you may have microbial growth before process, and you can have post-processing contamination. If after the pasteurization, the product is not properly handled, you can contaminate, especially with listeria. As I said, listeria can be everywhere, and leading to unsafe conditions for that product. So products that rely on, manufacturers that rely on ROP for their products, they will need to control refrigeration temperatures very very carefully. And when that is the only barrier against growth of pathogens, those products cannot be sold. They can be maintained, but you need proper records. Shannon is going to talk about that. Those will have to be available for inspection. Because of these reasons, that's why inspectors and regulatory authorities in general are concerned about processes that rely on ROP. A company can manufacture that. You will be allowed to do that. You just need to follow these protocols to get that process. Some of the products may need a variance, may need some specific guidance from a processing authority or regulatory authorities, and that's exactly what Shannon is going to be talking to us about. We will leave questions for the end, Diane. Shannon is going to go through her questions now, her presentation now, and then we'll be waiting for questions. Shannon, you're up.
Okay, great. Thank you, Bruno. Am I able to share my screen?
I believe you are.
Okay. Hi, everybody.
Can try it if I need to. I'll change your setting.
Okay, here we go. Oh, back to the beginning. All right. So now that we know all of the risks and ways we can potentially control reduced oxygen packaging for certain types of foods, we're going to get into the nuts and bolts of how we actually can make sure that we're aligned with all of the regulatory requirements set forth. So there's two big documents, the food code, as well as the specifically the Code of Federal Regulations that pertain to some of the specific requirements of reduced oxygen packaging and food processing in general. So I will go into detail about areas that we'll want to make sure we're looking at for those. And we're going to go over what's a variance, how to obtain a variance from the State Department of Ag and Markets. We're going to brush over HACCP, and hopefully that's a term that everybody is somewhat familiar about. We're going to go over the food code as far as specifics to reduced oxygen packaging and the specialized processing methods as Bruno talked about in some of these cases specific to control monitoring and things around time and temperature specifically. So what is a variance? It is a document provided by a regulatory authority, so the State Department of Ag and Markets or the FDA, but most likely the Ag and Markets Department will issue for very specific cases of reduced oxygen packaging of certain types of products. That is a very specific allowance. So it will call out the exact food, the process that is used to control it, and most likely will also call out the HACCP plan that's going to be used throughout that allowance. The variance is required for a variety of food products that are going to be used in reduced oxygen packaging. That can be anything from smoking or curing meat as a method of preservation. That can also include any kind of acidifying used to preserve food like vinegar, citric acid, as well as any kind of raw vegetables, raw meats, as Bruno talked about. These can also be reduced oxygen packaged in their raw state, and that is part of the control actually in that case. And also any kind of specific instance that is actually called out in the food code that is going to be specifically controlled for time and temperature. And how you get a variance, the State Department will actually want you to have some kind of typically process authority validation or letter of approval, as well as a HACCP plan. So HACCP stands for Hazard Analysis and Critical Control Point, and it is a systemized approach to an entire processing method. So it'll include all of those hazards, potentially risky to your process, that listeria, potentially salmonella even, CBOT, of course, as Bruno mentioned. And it'll also include all of those critical control points that are necessary to maintain control over the safety of the product. The process authority approval, the actual review that a process authority does will include the hazard analysis portion of your HACCP plan, as well as identifying those critical control points. So that it's a really helpful start to what then you will start to cater to your specific operation. And the HACCP plan must be submitted to the regulatory authority before you start manufacturing the product. There are some specific cases that a variance is not required, which include a time and temperature process that is being used to control the safety of the product. So in this case, it would have to be a instance where you are going to keep the product on site and you are claiming liability of being able to monitor and control the both time as well as the temperature of that product throughout its entire shelf life. So for folks in the farm to school type of setting, this might actually be fitting for you. You might not actually need a variance, but regardless, even if you don't need a variance, you still do need a HACCP plan for the reduced oxygen packaged type of method. The only exception to that is if you are going to be ROPing cheese and it follows all of these three situations here specific to the actual storage, the labeling and use of that product within a very short amount of time, 48 hours of production. All of the scenarios that could possibly be used with a reduced oxygen environment include this list. That is not to say that these don't need proper review, potentially analysis and validation. So even if your product does fall in this category, going through a process authority approval and review, as well as obviously the variance, if that applies, is really important. And that includes any kind of raw meat or vegetable, cheeses that are very specific to the standard of identity, meaning hard cheese, semi-soft or pasteurized processed cheese, any cured meats, foods with a pH naturally below 4.6, so that we know Clostridium botulinum is not a risk. And that also covers foods with a water activity below 0.91, also not a risk for CBOT. Any kind of frozen foods, as well as fish, and fish specifically has some requirements that do not allow any kind of reduced oxygen package unless it is frozen before, during, and after it's been packaged in that reduced oxygen environment, as well as cook, chill, or sous vide products. All right, so when you establish a HACCP plan, you will be really outlining the specific parameters for identifying the hazards as well as controlling those hazards. And in order to properly control them, they need to be measurable, monitored, and recorded to make sure that you are ensuring the safety throughout that process. So you'll need to have the actual cold storage temperatures as well as the time that it takes to get to that temperature, as well as any kind of limits to the shelf life itself. Now for frozen foods, that's not really a, sorry, I can't see the slide here. There we go. For frozen foods, that's not really a concern. Freezing kind of stops time, if you will. Since it is frozen, no microorganisms can actually grow. So you won't have a set expiration date for frozen food unless you're going to have some kind of quality assurance there that you might want to put in, 4 to 6 months to a year on there. And your refrigerator or freezing storage unit must have electronic monitoring capabilities, as well as having a visual check that is done at least twice a day and recorded in a simple log system. Products also must be properly labeled. So you'll want to have instructions for the storage temperature required of the product. For frozen products, we typically set that at 0 degrees Fahrenheit. And then any refrigerated products below 41 degrees Fahrenheit. A use by date for refrigerated foods should be displayed on the package and properly labeled as such, as well as having the date and time that it was packaged, so we can make sure the shelf life is carried out properly throughout its shelf life. For sous vide products specifically, HACCP records need to be kept for at least 6 months and able to be shown to a inspector if they have any questions. For procedures and safe handling of reduced oxygen packaged foods, hopefully everybody has heard of or somewhat familiar of good manufacturing practices. Any kind of food production should be made in a way that follows good manufacturing practices. And that is a set of requirements called out in detail in the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 117. And the Institute for Food Safety at Cornell also does have a online training for good manufacturing practices. So if you're not familiar with it or would like to train your staff, that is a class online that is offered, I believe, at any point throughout the year, so you can look into that. But it will include training and the knowledge around the things pertinent to making sure a area is safe. Having cleaning and good sanitation procedures actually written and allowing that to be trained to your employees. That includes safe handling practices, the types of equipment that'll be used, the facilities, and time and temperature that must be followed throughout the process. Establishing procedures for preventing cross-contamination. So if you have ready-to-eat foods, you're not also preparing raw meats in that same area. Allergens is a big thing to keep in mind with being able to separate various processes. And ready-to-eat foods must have some kind of protection, either through utensils or gloves, so that we're not interfering with our bare hands with those types of products. As far as handling, there will need to be instructions on the package if any kind of further treatment is necessary. So any kind of cooking requirements to pasteurization temperatures, like 165 for 1 minute, for example. And food must be cooled to at least 41 degrees within a very specific time frame. If you are cooking the product, then from 135 Fahrenheit to 70 degrees must happen within 2 hours of manufacturing the product. And then from a further 70 to 41 degrees within 4 hours. So that's a total of 6 hours for any kind of prepared food needs to be cooled within that time frame. And if you're going to further freeze the product, that must be done within 24 hours to 0 degrees Fahrenheit or less. The refrigerated use by date, as far as the food code calls out, may be issued for up to 30 days after the product is packaged, but for some cases might actually not last that long. So a process authority taking a look at what the specific product and process entails will be able to call that out and establish a good shelf life for the product. Frozen foods specifically are using the freezing, that temperature control, as the primary control for safety. So especially for fish, this must be made frozen before it's vacuum packaged, after it's vacuum packaged, and during the entire shelf life. If freezing is the only control, so for low acid foods, for example, anything above that 4.6 level, if it's going to be kept frozen, it will also need to follow that same regime. So it needs to be frozen before it's actually vacuum packed or MAP or control atmosphere. Any kind of reduced oxygen must have that freezing before that's packaged, during the entire shelf life, and then before it's thawed. So if you're going to keep it frozen until its use, that's fine to keep the package and seal intact. But if you are going to plan on thawing it, then the package must be opened before you start to thaw the product. On-premises handling, preparation, and consumption may allow for more than a 30-day refrigerated shelf life, depending on the product, and can be taken into consideration when a process authority is reviewing the product. But regardless, the cold chain must be carried out throughout the process and detailed in the HACCP plan that you're following. Specific to sous vide and cook chill processing methods, these have a very specific set of requirements. They cannot be sold, number one, to the public. So they would only be allowed in a business that is using them on site, consumed on premises, or a different location that's also part of that business entity. And you must maintain the cold chain throughout that process. If you are going to be distributing it to a different location, that cold chain must be monitored, recorded throughout that entire process. Of course, these products, as all products go, must be protected from potential contamination throughout the process, and properly cooked all the way through. So depending on what the product is, it might have a different temperature for what that looks like. Once a product is packaged, it must be immediately cooled and follow that same regime as I had touched on already, from 135 to 70 within 2 hours, a further 41 degrees within 4 hours, taking no more than a total of 6 hours to get from at least 135 Fahrenheit to 41 degrees or less. Labeling the product is also very important to include the product name as well as the date it was packaged. And for sous vide and cook chill products, there are some various options to consider. If you want to have an extended shelf life, you can cool it one of 3 ways that will allow for either a 7-day shelf life or up to a 30-day shelf life after packaging if you are rapidly cooling the temperature within the product. And for cheese specifically, it is allowed, but only if the product is completely being repackaged. So this doesn't include you making your own cheese on site, but cheeses can be reduced oxygen packaged if they follow one of these 3 standards of identity. So the CFR 133 calls out the actual standards of identity for processed cheese, semi-soft, and hard cheeses. And if it does meet one of those, you can apply for a review with the process authority to start your HACCP plan, but again, that won't require a variance from the state to do so. And generally for cheeses, as well as any reduced oxygen packaged food, the use by date cannot exceed more than 30 days from the original sell or use by date unless it's being frozen. And if not, then discarded after that point. And I think that's all I've got. And I realized some of this was pretty general. So if folks have specific questions for Bruno or myself, please feel free to unmute yourselves or.
Okay, and there has been some questions put in the chat box, which I've seen. Before we go into the question and answer period, I want to launch a poll that I did, which is basically a little feedback before, because some people might need to get going soon. So before you go, if you could please complete this poll that I've put up. I think there's 5, maybe 6 questions. It shouldn't take too long. Trying to get a feel for who the audience represents, and then some feedback questions. Are you seeing that, Shannon? Is everybody seeing that
I
poll?
am, yeah. Great questions. Thank you for putting this out.
Could you talk about the class a little bit more?
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
Sorry, could you talk about the class a little bit more?
Oh, the course that you offer at the Food Venture Center?
Are you referring to the one I mentioned, the good manufacturing practices? Bruno, are you maybe a little more familiar with that?
Yeah, maybe maybe a little. The Good Manufacturing Practices program is an online course offered by the Institute for Food Safety. It's, I think, 16 modules. I think you should expect about 10 to 12 hours of interaction. So it's a pretty extensive course, and it covers the CFR 117, the most current good manufacturing practices regulation, and it goes into detail about different types of processes and how to how to comply with the regulation. I will search for a link here and post it on the chat.
Another question that came from Becky, who's with the Harvest New York program. Why does the package, it's just talking about the oxygen sealed package or the vacuum sealed package, why does the package have to be opened before thawing?
Okay, the reason is that the, you want to go, Shan? Go ahead.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Bruno.
Okay, during thawing, you can, of course, the temperature will be higher than the temperature necessary for maintaining all the water frozen, right? You will have water liquid pooling at the outside and closer to the surface of the bag. In that region, you may have a temperature that would lead to growth of the psychotrophic strains of Clostridium botulinum, meaning those that can grow at lower temperature. So the way to avoid that situation is by opening the bag, allowing oxygen into the bag, and that will prevent their growth. Does that make sense? Whose question was that?
Becky.
Betty, was that?
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
And then Philippi from St. Lawrence County Cooperative Extension asked, did I catch that right? The food must be frozen before ROP.
Yes, that is required depending on the product. So for most cases, in these situations for schools, I imagine people are going to be reduced oxygen packaging low acid foods. So any kind of, potatoes, starches, most vegetables are low acid foods. So the freezing will actually be the primary control for Clostridium botulinum in these cases. And thus, must be done before it's put into that environment. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you, Shannon. I guess, so would it be a safe manufacturing process if someone was, if they were using sheet pans, or if they're blanching and then rolling a speed rack into a walk-in freezer and then packing the next day and doing the vacuum packing, bagging and packing it the next day?
Yep, that would be fine.
Okay.
Yeah, and typically we say up to 3 days. If you're going to be cooking it ahead and then refrigerating it, you can hold it safely for 3 days before you freeze and then vacuum pack it.
In the Saratoga schools, we're specifically thinking of freezing tomatoes. I know they're kind of borderline. How do you consider them? Do you consider them low acid or high acid?
They're high acid. There is an FDA, there is an FDA document with a list of the pH of most food ingredients, and there is unequivocal tomatoes are below 4.6.
Okay, let's see, other questions. If frozen food, I'm sorry, if food is frozen before vacuum seal, do you still get the benefits of vacuum sealing frozen foods, i.e. less ice crystals? I guess that has to do with quality.
Yeah, the short answer is yes, but so you will have vacuum, you will not have the formation of ice crystals, or at least you're going to have a lot less. The reason for freezing before you vacuum pack is that, as I said, oxygen is soluble, so you will have some oxygen dissolved in the product, and that can increase the safety of the product by a lot, especially when the product is being thawed or subject to accidental temperature abuse. If you want to cook the product in the bag, you will end up being a cook, chill, or sous vide process, which will require a much more stringent records. But so we mentioned that very briefly, but that would be a possibility as well. You won't be able to sell those under refrigeration.
Okay, what I would like people to put in the chat is anything else you'd like to learn or feel like you need to learn on this topic that we might do as a follow-up to this training. So if you have any thoughts or ideas on that, you can put that in the chat. And finally, another question that I have for Shannon and Bruno is, can you and the Food Venture Center help schools to obtain the variants that they would need? And that, you know, the scheduled process or whatever, I'm not sure I'm using the right terms. And how would we go about doing that, working with you?
Yes, we've got a online submission form that folks can check out right at the Cornell Food Venture Center. And there is one specific for reduced oxygen packaging requests. As we discussed with Diane in an earlier meeting, we may be able to provide some kind of more of a blanket letter of allowance, depending on the types of products that various schools want to use. And we can take a look at that in further detail and assess what all we can provide to make that a little bit more of a streamlined process for everybody.
So would it be most helpful if the schools, people in the farm to school group got together and talked about what would be the most likely produce that they would want to freeze? And
Yeah.
then you would give the variant, or you would give the instructions per that produce?
Definitely. If people can get together and put together a list that we can review all in one, I think that would be the best case scenario. Bruno, do you have any?
No, I agree that that would be ideal, and in that way we could make a document that could be used by any of the schools manufacturing those foods. We basically would just need to make sure that each document is sent to schools with the responsible person and address of that specific manufacturing location.
Can I ask a question kind of piggybacking on that?
Absolutely.
So when you're saying you could potentially provide a blanket document, would that be, so say like we miraculously all came together, anybody who's going to be doing this, one for like everybody across the state, or do you need to provide, like you were just saying, if we did one for everybody across the state, we just also get letters that go to each individual district or school that's going to be doing this, like that will have the equipment to do it on their site?
Yeah, that's what we are looking at.
Okay.
And I would want to say this. Now, our program, we don't have we're not grant funded. The reason why it's hard for us to do this type of services from our perspective is that we will have to create the documentation. Time goes into that, and we are not getting a lot of support for paying our bills, right? This is definitely something that Shannon and I and the team will be doing in our personal time to help in this project that we do want to contribute.
Okay, yeah. So I think that there are definitely several programs throughout the state that have been funded, like through New York State Farm to School grants or through USDA Farm to School grants that are processing and freezing. I do see like somebody just dropped something in the chat. So because you guys do have limited time, I think that makes a lot of sense for us to kind of quote unquote get together and come up with a list so you don't have to, so we're not giving you multiple requests from all these different districts. But then on top of that, one other thing in specifically that you mentioned was that with Cook Chill, because of the fact that this equipment is so expensive, that perhaps districts are getting through these grants, there's a lot of collaboration that happens across several districts. So say the equipment is 5 districts are collaborating and there's equipment located at one district and they're preparing, they're doing like a Cook Chills. I don't know, maybe they're doing chili or something like that. That's going to be a Cook Chill. And it's being prepared at one district, but the intention when they put in these grants is for it to be used at several different districts. So taken off site and used somewhere else. Am I right that they can't do that?
That's a commissary, right, Shannon?
No, not a commissary. So different districts. So a commissary is typically like central to one district. So say you have like 5 small districts that are collaborating together. And the equipment is housed at one district. So say it's housed at, I'm trying to think of a fake district name, but I can't think of anything. So say it's housed at District A. And all the food is going to be processed there, but it's going to be used by districts B, C, and D also. Is Cook Chill specifically not, it looked like the rules that you put in there for Cook Chill, that it can't be taken and used by, you said it can't be used by a different business. So are the districts, I mean, I guess you would look at the different separate districts as separate businesses. So just what's allowed, what's not allowed, specifically with Cook Chill. The other stuff seems more straightforward.
I think there may be some wiggle room there. I mean, even from district to district, they're all public businesses, right? I mean, essentially,
They're all public schools.
They're all a state-run business. So I think there may be some allowance in there that we could still work within that requirement. What do you think, Bruno?
Yeah, we know companies that do that. The only thing that is not clear here is because the companies is under the same ownership, right? It's the same. I mean, this is one of those situations. If we cannot get an allowance to do that, that's when law is getting on the way of the evolution of society, right? So I'm sure that we can push for a specific variance. You know, maybe we need a variance, and it's not the same ownership, but it's the same, I don't know, state, whatever higher, level of institutional hierarchy we can find. But it's definitely done by private businesses, and I think Shannon and I know the path that we would have to pursue to get you the documentation you need.
Okay, yeah, that would be really helpful. Thank you. We'll reach out to you more about that.
Yeah, it would be great.
Any other questions? I see that Marissa, if she's still on, she says that she has a list of the Sydney School District will be processing and vacuum sealing this summer blueberries, broccoli, green beans, etc. I was just wondering if they already have a variance. Have they been through this process, and what was that experience for them?
Hi, I'm Marissa. I'm the farm to school coordinator at Sydney Central School District. I actually reached out to our local health department in Oneonta, and they said we did not need a variance and that we just have to do the request for waiver to allow for ROP products. It's a 14-page document that I am working on filling out, and it goes through everything of how you will cook your ROP products, how you will, if you have corrective action for everything, how you'll cool it, how you'll reheat it, and it lists, you have to list out every single step of washing, processing, drying, blanching, ice bath, everything. You gotta list everything specifically. So I'm in the process of filling that out at the moment, getting it signed this week and then faxing it over to the health department for their hopeful approval.
Do you have to do that for each individual product? And then Shannon or Bruno, is that sort of what you would be helping schools with, that all that paperwork that she is diligently going through?
So for the actual specific products, the folks at the State Department said that I could just say something along the lines of, the following process will be for these specific items. So for example, like if I'm blanching squash, broccoli, and green beans, I have to say my process for each of those, and then just going through that. So not necessarily listing out your vegetable or fruit and then going through the process. You can say, for these following items, this is the process. Makes it a little bit more condensed.
I see. So Bruno or Shannon, is that what she's doing? Is that kind of what you would be helping with, or how does that relate to what you would be helping the schools with?
So I have not actually seen that that form she's referring to. We have not done that, helped out with that in the past. I don't know if you have specifically, Bruno, but I haven't dealt with that. And I'd be interested to know from Marissa's experience if they're going to further require her to seek process authority approval. Typically for these products that she's listed out, regardless of whether they're acid or not, we find that inspectors want to have that process authority validation in the process of getting that waiver. And some of these products are low acid, so there would be specific parameters necessary for some of them versus others. Cook steps, cooling, freezing, obviously, things like that.
Yeah, which the state refers as the hazard analysis, right?
Yeah, this is what it looks like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is the form, Diane, that we shared on that last call.
So the document that we provide is not this one filled out. It is a completely separate analysis and set of processing parameters that would cover all of the things that she's including in here. So
yeah, and what we provide is documentation that you need when you apply for a variance. And in some situations when you do not need a variance, the inspectors will still ask you to have a hazard analysis, and we provide a document that will usually accommodate that need, that requirement.
I've heard in the past that it's important to reach out to your local health department because they might have more specific regulations or they might have broader regulations and not so strict. So that's why I run straight to the Oneonta Health Department instead of the actual like big head honcho state department.
Correct. And that's exactly where they're operating with you with that form, because they have jurisdiction. They don't have to bump it to the state level.
Mhm.
It is a good strategy.